At a major international biblical studies conference some years ago, probably 15 years ago at this point, I heard a major scholar, give use an image that has stuck in my mind for many years, and I've come back to it several times. It's the image of a black hole. And this scholar, I believe it was Bruce Zuckerman, who was a professor at UCLA, was a scholar of the Book of Job and West Semitic languages and literatures. This scholar said, when we read a book like Job or some other very technical sections of the Bible with very odd references that just seem to come out of nowhere, with language and with references to mythology and things that just seem to come out of nowhere, it's almost like we're encountering a version of a black hole. We can't quite see where this material is coming from, at least on biblical terms, in terms of the literature that we have. But like a black hole, we have to assume that there is some other bigger literature, some bigger world of storytelling and mythology and language and religion and life that really was there, that was influencing this other literature, namely the Bible. And so too, like in physics, I guess, on a simple analogy, we can't really see a black hole, but we can see how things around it are reacting, and we can make a guess about what the black hole might be, or how big it is, or where it is, and how influential it is. So too, when we read obscure things in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, for example, like in the book of Job or elsewhere, we might assume that there's a bigger background literature here, a flourishing world of ideas and characters and language and all this that must be there, and that original audiences must have, or at least some of them, or at least the authors of the Hebrew Bible in some places, must have understood. They must be drawing upon this. Let me give an example of a case where I think something like this is going on, which raises other mysteries too about the way that early biblical interpreters in early Judaism and in early Christianity, in the period of the New Testament even, gives us clues too about the way that they acted as interpreters and the way that they saw these same kinds of mysteries. I raise the case, the famous, mysterious case of Melchizedek. Melchizedek being a character whose name appears only 2 times in the Hebrew Bible, but who then receives an extended and profound and dense and very weedy, detailed meditation, allegory, you could say, or typology, in the book of Hebrews, chapters 5 through 8. We'll get to Hebrews, but first, let's review. Who is this Melchizedek and what he is doing? There's an amazing thematic and linguistic mystery at the heart of the Melchizedek exchange, and I begin here in Genesis 14, which is the only time that Melchizedek really appears with any substance as a character in a narrative. Avram, he's going to later be Abraham, has just returned from defeating some kings. Avram is running wild across the ancient Near East, building altars, defeating enemies, capturing people, doing stuff. And he comes by a certain city or place called Salem, which is widely thought to be, seems to be a cipher for Jerusalem. And this would be the only place where a patriarch in the Bible actually comes to Jerusalem. So this is an important moment in the Old Testament because it links a major figure, Abraham, with the city of Jerusalem, which otherwise doesn't really become that popular or interesting until David captures it and makes it the capital, right? But you get that connection here of David back to Abraham in this moment. So this passage already seems to be significant on its own right for that fact. Verse 18 of Genesis 14, and King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. Okay, so for Christian audiences here, got bread and wine going, okay, communion. He, presumably King Melchizedek, was priest of El Elyon in Hebrew, God Most High. Is that God Most High the God who is also identified as the Lord, Yahweh, or Elohim, or that God, or is it some other God? Not stated. I mean, presumably we're supposed to think that. He blessed him and said, now, unclear pronoun use, he blessed him. Who blessed whom? If he blessed him, well, we're going to get into this. This is a problem, unclear pronoun use. He blessed him. Sometimes we can learn this from context. In this case, the first unclear pronoun use, of which there are 2 here, the second one being more significant for our purpose, in verse 19, it's clarified by the next phrase. He blessed him and said, blessed be Avram by El Elyon. In other words, the he who's blessing him, it's Melchizedek who's blessing Avram. That's just obvious from the context. I don't think there's any other way to read that. So I insert the names. Melchizedek blessed Avram and said, blessed be Avram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Avram, I'm reading from the NRSV, Oxford Annotated Study Bible, and Avram gave him, Melchizedek, 1/10 of everything. Now, interesting intrigue. The intrigue begins. The Hebrew Bible does not say Avram gave him 1/10 of everything. This is going to be important when we get to Hebrews later, so hang in there with me. Rather, I pull up the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia here, the classic basic critical edition of the Hebrew Bible that scholars use, based on the Leningrad Codex, which is our main Masoretic text of the Bible. And the text does not say Avram. There is no subject there of the clause in verse 20. Instead, right after the blessing, it says, Vayaten lo, and he gave him, Vayaten, from Natan there. We have the third masculine singular. It's built in, and he gave him, but there is no subject stated. Who is the subject here then? Who is giving whom the tithe? There is a biblical pattern that you might see being set up here, which is that Abraham, or Avram, is the progenitor, the forefather of Judaism, of all of the Jewish lines, going way back from the end of Genesis chapter 11 and through 12. God is going to bless the whole earth through him. And in fact, the Levites are going to be descendants, the priestly class in ancient Israel are going to be descendants of Abraham, and therefore you could say already we have a pattern. You go to the Levite in Jerusalem, or you go to the priest, let's say in Jerusalem. The priest here in Jerusalem is Melchizedek, although, yes, he's called a priest of El Elyon here. And that priest will give you a blessing, and you give the priest a tithe. So this would make sense then. Avram gave the priest 1/10 of everything. The priest gives Avram the blessing. However, and this is where this just kind of boggles the mind and gives me a headache, and I'm trying to think through this, okay? The grammar and the sense of the action here could indicate, seems to indicate, might indicate the grammatical construction. Who's doing the speaking and who's doing the action can then help us clear up the unclear pronoun use. Who is the him in Vayitain? And he gave him. It would seem to be Melchizedek gave Avram 1/10 of everything. In other words, he's paying the Levite, who's already inside the body, you could say, or inside the DNA of Avram. He's giving him the tithe. Or is the text speaking of a reversal? Now Melchizedek is actually giving up his priestly role, you could say, in that sense, or he's honoring by blessing. Avram gives Melchizedek the tithe, even though in Avram are the Levites, but later there'll be like this reversal where Avram takes on, and Judaism and the Levites, then they take on that priestly identity. So in other words, what I'm saying here is we have a sense of the action itself, which seems to suggest that Melchizedek is giving Avram the tithe. And then you have this other kind of sense where no, it would actually make sense for Avram to be giving Melchizedek the tithe. So who is giving whom the tithe? Just a classic ambiguity here in the text, and commentators can go back and forth. I was looking at some Genesis commentaries on my shelf. I just picked this one, Klaus Westermann. Might not be the best Genesis commentary, but it's not the worst. Several volumes, very detailed, great in this continental commentary series, great, European tradition. Westermann, of course, a German scholar. Here's his take on this. He says, with this episode in chapter 14, verses 18 to 20, we are again in another world. I love that phrase, in another world, because this incident does seem to take place almost like in another world. And I think there is something that ancient interpreters, by the time we get to Hebrews, were legitimately picking up on here in this text when they make an elaborate allegory comparing Melchizedek to Jesus. And what they're seeing is that there's just something strange about this. Like, who is this priest who just comes out of nowhere and pronounces this blessing and so on? Westermann notes that the language has a decidedly cultic sound, which means it sounds like a religious institution that's being represented here, of temples and priests and tithes and things like that, right? He follows the idea that Avram acknowledges the priestly dignity of Melchizedek by giving him the tithe. In other words, Avram is the he in Vayetain who gives him, Melchizedek, the tithe. It's a cultic exchange. There's a blessing and then there's a tithe. So it's like a transaction that goes back and forth. But in his translation of the text, his translation of the text at hand in verse 18, he does have a note here, quoting another scholar, where he says, Melchizedek is the grammatical subject. In other words, he's acknowledging that grammatically, Melchizedek is the one who's giving Avram the tithe, grammatically and in the sense of the passage as the language sits currently. So he acknowledges that, but he says, no, we should read it the opposite way. He says, here he's commenting on the passage. He says, the tithe is never spoken of as a tribute paid from something acquired on a particular occasion. So is the idea that Avram had just done this plundering, got the tithe, and then is just paying it now to Melchizedek? No, he says that's not the way it's spoken of. The aim of the closing verse is to legitimate the regular payment of the tithe by means of a single event which took place long ago, this kind of pattern-setting event. Abraham presented the tithe from the booty to the priest of Jerusalem. The Melchizedek episode, therefore, has an etiological character. In other words, it's setting up an institution. There's an audience who's living in the now of the time of the authorship, and they're now looking back at this ancient moment to legitimate the idea that you go to Jerusalem and pay a tithe there to the priest, right? It's linking it with the patriarch. But there's ambiguity here, like, well, why is that grammatically so not clear? Okay, the next stop in our journey, and by the way, you can look in the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 21 to find this incident or this institution. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel as a possession. So this idea that you give the Levites a tithe. And we also have later in the book of Genesis, by the way, I think in chapter 28, we have the tithe there where Jacob himself comes to a particular place. This is in Genesis 28, if I'm not mistaken. Why not turn there? Yes, Genesis 28. Jacob comes to a particular place. Bethel, this house of God. And it's a kind of a sacred place, a special place. And he promises that if he comes back, that if he's kept safe by God, he'll come back to the special place and he will give 1/10. So the idea that a patriarch comes to a special place and pays a tithe is a bit of a pattern in Genesis. And that could militate for the reading that in fact the NRSV has inserted in by inserting the word Avram for the unclear pronoun, that in fact it is Avram who pays the tithe, even against the kind of grammatical sense of the passage itself and the sense of the action. Okay, next stop on this mystery tour is, of course, Psalm 110 famously begins, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make the enemies your footstool." Verse 4, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." What is that supposed to mean? I mean, who exactly is this applied to? The commentary notes here in the Oxford Annotated Bible note that the tradition is applied here only to the Davidic king, and sometimes kings are described as having priestly duties. So they see the context here as Davidic, as royal, that this is about David. But kind of odd that Melchizedek appears nowhere and then just suddenly in this psalm, randomly, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now we come to this question of Hebrews, and I want to come back to this concept of the black hole, the dark matter of this literature, the things that are missing but that must be there. The author of Hebrews, the unknown anonymous author, don't know who it is, maybe Paul, but probably not, goes on a 3-chapter allegory typology bender to basically make a comparison between Melchizedek, this righteous, priestly, king, everything figure, and Jesus Christ. Every high priest chosen from among mortals begins chapter 5, and quickly it moves to Christ. So also Christ did not glorify himself, but was appointed. And then quoting then from Psalm 110, "You, Jesus, are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Chapter 7, though, is where the action really heats up. This King Melchizedek of Salem, Jerusalem, priest of the Most High, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings, and to him, Abraham apportioned 1/10 of everything. So Avram is giving the tithe. And the author goes on to say, and I love this analogy in 7:9, one might even say, One might even say that Levi himself, who receives the tithe, remember from earlier Numbers, it is the Levites who receive tithes from the people, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. So in other words, he's saying in the DNA of Abraham, inside is like a little miniature body of the Levite, and that Levite, a representative of the Jewish priestly class, is in fact paying respect, paying tithes to Melchizedek, who is in fact Jesus. So you have this sense then where Judaism is handing over the priestly role over to Jesus, right? And that's, I think, is the purpose of this thing. As the author says in 620, Jesus, the forerunner on our behalf, has entered the sacred space, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, it may be the case that as a reader in the first century, presuming that Hebrews was written and read first in the first century, maybe the second century, who knows, AD, it may be that this imagery of Melchizedek would have just made sense on its own. And even that one reference to Melchizedek in Genesis, followed by the second quick reference in Psalm 110, was enough to really draw this on. But one might have suspected a kind of dark matter. Something's going on here, like why all this Melchizedek language, and why is the author here equating a literal historical, quasi-historical character presented as part of the history in Genesis, the narrative, let's say, as a divine figure, as Jesus, that figure somehow is Jesus, and that Abraham, in paying the tithe to him, is actually somehow actually honoring Jesus and not just this pagan king of God Most High or whomever he is, back in Genesis 14. And now the final chapter in our journey for now. Of course, there's so many more deeper things here that you can look into as well. The dark matter. There seems to have been, we have one really interesting clue from the Dead Sea Scrolls that shows that there apparently must have been a flourishing mythology or story tradition or interpretive tradition around the figure of Melchizedek in early Judaism, or at least some strains of early Judaism, because we have a document from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called 11Q13. That's just the scroll numbering of the cave and the place where it was. But it's labeled, at least in this Dead Sea Scroll edition I'm reading from here, translated and commentated on by Wise, Ebeg, and Cook, called The Coming of Melchizedek. The Coming of Melchizedek, 11Q13. And I'll put some links down below if you want to follow some of these trails. This 11Q13 document, though, somebody took a bunch of texts from the Hebrew Bible that relate to the idea of Jubilee. Remember in Scripture, you have a kind of a Sabbath rest that the land can have, a sabbatical every 7 years, where you leave the land on its own. However, in the Jubilee year, in the 50th year, every piece of land, all kinds of things, even slaves get set free and revert to their natural state, right? The fascinating thing about this 11Q13 text is that these authors seem to have collected a bunch of texts relating to the Jubilee, and they push it one level further. Not only is it about land returning to its natural owners and slaves being set free, it's also a time when sins will be forgiven. So they're doing a kind of extra interpretation of the Jubilee year. And not only that, they import the name of Melchizedek into this text in a couple of ways that are really fascinating. Namely, as the authors put it here in their introduction, Melchizedek is the agent of salvation who's going to bring the forgiveness of sins to people in this special year, this Jubilee year, this mystical Jubilee. And on top of that, in one instance in the text itself, I'll read it in a second, they actually take a verse from the Bible, Isaiah 61:2, famous one. This is the year of the Lord's favor. In fact, I feel inspired, like just to get the full impact here of what he's saying, we got to read Isaiah 61:2. Famous verse. I believe it appears in the New Testament, even in a very famous place with reference to Jesus. Isaiah 61:2 reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted." Jesus goes into the synagogue and picks up the scroll and reads this, right? "And proclaim liberty to the captives, release to the prisoners." You see that Jubilee idea of release. 61:2, "To proclaim the year of the Lord's, Yahweh's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God." So very serious text, really important text. In this 11Q13 document, the author quotes a bunch of things, is quoting all kinds of Jubilee things, talks about proclaiming Jubilee to the captives, and from the inheritance of Melchizedek, for Melchizedek, who will return them what is rightfully theirs. So Melchizedek somehow will spiritually come and somehow symbolically or literally or in some mystical way actually do the returning himself. But later, then the Day of Atonement shall follow after the 10th Jubilee period, when he shall atone for all the sons of light, and the people who are predestined to Melchizedek, broken text upon them, for this is the time decreed, here's the quote from Isaiah 61:2, for the year of the Lord's favor. No, not the year of the Lord's favor. The author of this scroll actually takes out the word the Lord, Yahweh, and inserts the name of Melchizedek. The year of Melchizedek's favor. What a bold move, right? Like what dark matter? Like what was going on in the community of worship and thought that they felt like they could put this figure Melchizedek in here? What had this figure Melchizedek become in this community that the name Melchizedek, like was it read as an alternate name for God? Is this now some other messianic figure who's in the text? Now, in this light, whatever that belief system was at Qumran there, maybe in the 1st century BC, now the author of Hebrews, this emphasis on Melchizedek, now this emphasis starts to make a lot more sense. It reacts to a spiritual tradition, apparently, that was already existing in early Judaism, an interpretive tradition, which mysteriously and cryptically read the name of Melchizedek there as being something more than just some king who was living somewhere. Here we see these interpreters, both in Hebrews and in 11Q13, participating very classically. Even though this is kind of wild and hard to figure out, they are acting in a very predictable manner for what we know about how ancient interpreters did their interpretation during this time period of the first few centuries BC and AD. Namely, and James Kugel writes about this in his book, How to Read the Bible, they participate in at least a couple of the core assumptions that ancient interpreters did have. The most core assumption being that the Bible speaks cryptically. It speaks mysteriously. It says this, but it really means that. In other words, you could say, maybe more in another way, the Bible speaks symbolically. The Bible speaks allegorically. The Bible speaks typologically. A figure in the past is now this figure now, which leads then to the second assumption that Kugel points out, which I think we see here on display, is that the Bible speaks to the present world. The Bible is significant for the contemporary world, for now. So anyway, this idea of the dark matter is very intriguing to me because at least in that Dead Sea Scroll 11Q13, we actually do get a little bit of a glimpse at that dark matter. We can actually see in language some of these traditions that authors were interpreting and referring to.